The night Waverly Hess walked into Maison Soleil carrying a broken arm and a dying father's medical debt, nobody in that restaurant thought she would last a month. She was too quiet, too precise, too clearly meant for somewhere else. But that was exactly what made her dangerous. Waverly was 29 years old and had been 2 semesters from completing her PhD in biochemistry at Johns Hopkins when her father's Parkinson's diagnosis arrived like a stone through glass. She had packed her research notebooks into storage, sublet her studio in Baltimore, and come home to Ashfield, Pennsylvania, where her father, a retired civil engineer named Raymond Hess, had begun forgetting the names of tools he had used for 40 years. Within 18 months, the experimental treatment program had consumed every dollar of her savings, her father's pension, and a second mortgage on the house where Waverly had grown up. She had applied to Maison Soleil because it paid 40% more than any other restaurant in the city, and because its owner, a Lyonnaise-trained chef named Gaspard Vell, had a reputation for demanding absolutely nothing from his servers except competence and invisibility. Waverly was extraordinarily competent. She was also, by then, extraordinarily practiced at being invisible. The dining room of Maison Soleil occupied the restored ground floor of a Gilded Age brownstone in Philadelphia's Rittenhouse Square. The tables were covered in cream Belgian linen. The stemware was regal. The menu changed with the season, and the clientele changed with nothing. It was always the same rotating cast of old money, pharmaceutical executives, and the occasional senator who wanted to be seen but not photographed. Waverly moved through the room like a current of cold air. She refilled glasses before they were half empty. She anticipated allergy concerns before they were voiced. Her manager, a tightly wound man named Clifford Spears, acknowledged her competence by largely pretending she did not exist, which suited her perfectly. She had been working the room for 14 months when the Caldwell table was seated on a Thursday evening in late October. She knew who they were before they sat down. Everyone in Philadelphia knew the Caldwells. Nathaniel Caldwell had built a regional insurance empire over 4 decades into something approaching a national dynasty. He was 73 years old, silver-haired, and possessed of the kind of easy authority that did not need to announce itself. His son, Edmund Caldwell, was 38, recently named CEO of Caldwell Group, ahead of a rumored acquisition that had the business press in a low-grade frenzy. And walking slightly behind them, her hand resting lightly on the older man's elbow, was a woman Waverly did not recognize. She was perhaps 40, with dark hair swept back in a style that suggested money spent to look effortless. She wore a slate-gray dress and a single strand of pearls, and she moved with the calibrated poise of someone who had practiced it. Her name, Waverly would later learn, was Renata Voss. She had been Nathan Caldwell's private health consultant for the past 8 months, brought in, ostensibly, after Nathan's cardiologist had recommended a lifestyle restructure. She had the title of wellness advisor on her business card, and the manner of someone who had decided, some time ago, that the world owed her a much larger stage. Edmund held the chair out for her first, not for his father. Waverly noticed that. She was stationed as a back waiter that evening, pouring water, removing bread plates, staying out of the primary sightline. Their table's lead server was a polished man named Devlin Cross, who had been at Maison Soleil for 11 years and wore that fact on his face. He greeted Edmund first, then Renata, and addressed Nathan Caldwell as an afterthought, angling his body slightly away from the older man in the instinctive choreography of social mirroring. As Devlin rattled through the evening's menu, Waverly moved to fill Nathan Caldwell's water glass. Up close, he was not quite what she expected. He had the bearing of a man accustomed to rooms arranging themselves around him, but something else lived in his face now, a quieter thing, watchful and slightly lost. His eyes tracked Devlin's mouth with particular attention, following each word with the faint delay of someone working hard to hear. Waverly had seen that look in her father's face during the months before his Parkinson's progressed enough to explain the changes in him. The over-concentration, the slight lean forward, the way the world's noise seemed to reach him a half-second late. She had also seen it in patients' family members during the 4 months she had volunteered at a hearing loss clinic in Baltimore between her 2nd and 3rd year of graduate school. Nathan Caldwell was losing his hearing, and from the way his eyes moved, the specific arc of his attention, the way he tilted his head almost imperceptibly toward Edmund when his son spoke, she guessed he was compensating with lip reading, which meant that Renata Voss, seated directly across from him with a sleek silk clutch raised habitually in front of her mouth as she murmured to Edmund, was doing so in a position that made lip reading impossible. It might have been unconscious. Waverly gave it perhaps 4 seconds of benefit of the doubt. Then Renata laughed at something Edmund said and shifted her clutch higher, and Waverly watched Nathan Caldwell's expression move through the specific sequence she knew from her volunteer work. Effort, failure, the practiced smoothing over that people with hearing loss developed to avoid the social awkwardness of saying, again, that they hadn't caught it. It was not unconscious. Devlin asked if everyone was ready to order. Edmund spoke at length about the duck. Renata ordered a fish dish with 3 modifications. When Devlin turned to Nathan, Renata smoothly interrupted. Nathaniel will have the beef tenderloin, medium, and the roasted root vegetables instead of the gratin. His cardiologist has him watching dairy. She said it warmly, the way you might speak for a child who was shy with strangers, and Nathan Caldwell accepted it with a nod that was almost imperceptible, a nod that could have meant agreement or could have meant something else entirely. He hadn't been facing Devlin when Devlin asked the question. He likely hadn't heard it. Waverly moved to clear the bread plates on a neighboring table. Her hands were steady, her face showed nothing. She had learned, in 14 months at Maison Soleil, that the way to survive in a room like this was to be a surface rather than a person. You reflected back the image of the room. You did not introduce friction. Clifford Spears had told her in her first week that the clientele did not come here to be challenged. They came here to be confirmed. Waverly had understood that perfectly. She was an excellent surface. She was also standing 12 feet from Nathan Caldwell's chair, watching a man being managed in real time by someone who had decided he no longer needed to participate in his own dinner, fighting something that was not quite professional. It was cellular. It lived somewhere below her sternum, where she stored the memory of her father, sitting at the kitchen table with a grocery list in front of him, and a look of quiet defeat on his face because he could no longer read his own handwriting, and no one had noticed yet except her. She went back to the service station and stood very still for approximately 45 seconds. Then she picked up the bread basket and walked back to the table. She set a fresh roll near Nathan Caldwell's setting, and as she did, she leaned slightly into his field of vision and positioned herself so he could see her face clearly. She spoke at a moderate pace, enunciating without exaggerating. "Mr. Caldwell, I just wanted to confirm. Were you happy with the beef tenderloin, or would you prefer to hear the other options? I'm happy to go through them." It was a simple thing, a small thing. Devlin, across the room, shot her a look that could have stripped paint. Renata's chin lifted half an inch. Edmund looked up from his phone. Nathan Caldwell turned toward her with an expression that she would remember for a long time. It was surprise, first, then something that rearranged itself into something different, the specific, unguarded relief of someone who had been spoken to directly rather than around. "I think I'd like to hear the options," he said. His voice was measured, dignified, and very slightly cautious, the voice of someone who had learned to hold himself carefully in situations where he might have missed something. Waverly went through the menu quietly, facing him, taking her time. He asked a question about the lamb preparation that indicated he had significantly more culinary knowledge than his table companions were crediting him with. He chose the lamb. He thanked her by name. He had apparently read her name tag, which told her his vision, at least, was perfectly fine. Renata said nothing during this exchange. She simply watched Waverly with the evaluative stillness of someone cataloguing a problem. Clifford Spears appeared at Waverly's elbow the moment she stepped back from the table. "A word," he said, in the tone that meant it wasn't a word. In the narrow corridor between the kitchen and the dining room, he explained to her, with the particular precision of a man who believed in the dignity of professional hierarchy that she had overstepped. She was a back waiter. Back waiters did not retake orders. Back waiters did not insert themselves into table interactions that were being managed by the lead server. He did not use the word fired, but it lived in the air between the words he did use. "The gentleman's order had been placed," Spears said. "Renata Voss is well known to us. She manages his care comprehensively. Your involvement was not needed and not appropriate," Waverly said. "He didn't get to order his own dinner." Spears stared at her. "That is not your concern. He's a paying guest." "Waverly." Spears' voice dropped to its most terminal register. "Do you understand what table that is? That family has hosted 4 private dining events here in the past year. Edmund Caldwell sits on the board of 2 organizations that have given this restaurant award placements. You will go back to the floor and you will stay in your lane, and after service tonight, we will have a longer conversation about whether your tenure here is working out." He walked back toward the host stand. Waverly stood in the corridor for exactly 3 seconds. She thought about her father's experimental medication, which was running approximately $6,000 a month and was not, despite 2 appeal letters she had personally written, covered by his insurance plan. She thought about the rent on the apartment, where her father now lived with a part-time care aide she was also paying for. She thought about the fact that she was 3 months behind on her own rent. She walked back to the dining room. She was not going to do anything. She had decided that. She was going to fill water glasses and stay invisible, and she was going to do it for as long as it took to get her father stable, and then she was going to figure out the rest of her life from there. She was pouring water at the table adjacent to the Caldwells when she saw Nathan Caldwell's hand. He had a small leather notepad in front of him, the kind with a pen looped through the spine, the kind a man of his generation might carry out of habit, while Edmund and Renata were deep in a conversation that had the quiet, excluding intimacy of people who had been talking to each other for a long time before this dinner. Nathan had written something. He tore the small sheet from the pad, folded it once, and placed it on the tablecloth to his left, where it sat without any particular drama, like something he had set down and forgotten. But he glanced at Waverly when he did it, deliberately, then looked away. She moved to clear the bread basket. She palmed the folded note as she lifted the basket off the table. She tucked it into her apron. She read it 30 seconds later in the service station, her body blocking it from view. It said, "She monitors my phone and my mail. My doctor, not the one she introduced me to, retired early. 6 months. Said the new one was more comprehensive. I have not seen my attorney in 4 months. She says, he retired." Is that normal? Please, if you can. My son doesn't know. He trusts her. Waverly read it twice. Her hands were not shaking. That surprised her. She spent 60 seconds processing what she had in her hand. A wealthy elderly man, cognitively intact but with a concealed hearing loss, was describing a pattern of managed isolation from his professional advisors. His son was not a neutral party. The note said his son didn't know, which could mean his son was innocent, or could mean his son didn't want to know, and she had no way yet to determine which. Renata Voss had access to his medical care, his communications, and apparently his scheduling. Nathan Caldwell had waited for a moment when Renata's attention was elsewhere to pass a note to a woman he had known for approximately 11 minutes because she was the only person in the room who had spoken to him like he was still there. She thought about what Clifford Spears had said, "Not your concern." She looked at the note again. At the handwriting, measured and precise, the handwriting of an engineer or an architect, the handwriting of a man who had spent his life building things. The ink was dark. He had pressed hard. This was not impulsive. He had come in here tonight, prepared to do this, and had waited for the right person, and she happened to be the person who looked at him directly when she spoke. She folded the note back into her apron and walked to the host stand, where the reservation system was logged in. She needed one piece of information, and it took her 12 seconds to find it. The contact number Nathan Caldwell had provided when the reservation was made 18 months ago, before Renata Voss had arrived in his life. Not his cell phone, his direct office line at Caldwell Group's original headquarters on Walnut Street. She memorized it. Then she walked back to the floor and spent the next hour being a very good back waiter. At 9:40, the Caldwell party began to wrap up. Edmund was reviewing something on his phone. Renata was finishing a final glass of wine, her posture already angled toward departure. Nathan Caldwell was signing the check. Edmund had made a move for it, but Nathan had picked it up with a quiet authority that still, under everything, suggested who this man had been for most of his life. Waverly came to retrieve the check presenter. As she took it from his hands, she positioned herself carefully, the presenter as a shield between her action and Renata's sightline, and she placed a small folded receipt paper on the table beneath where his pen rested. On it she had written two things: the name of a legal clinic she knew from research she had done 2 years ago for her own family, one that specialized in elder financial protection, and the words, "Bring this to someone you chose yourself, not anyone she introduced to you." She did not write her name. She did not look at him directly again. Nathan Caldwell stood, straightened his jacket, and picked up the pen she had left with the check. As he pocketed it along with the receipt paper, his hand passed briefly over the table where the folded note had been, and the motion was the practiced, unhurried gesture of a man who had been making decisions quietly for 73 years. Waverly carried the check presenter to the back. 3 minutes later, Renata Voss came to find her. She didn't make a scene. That was what Waverly noted first. Renata Voss was far too practiced for scenes. She waited until Waverly was in the service corridor, then stepped in after her, and she smiled the kind of smile that reminded Waverly of certain faculty members at Johns Hopkins, people who had learned to weaponize pleasantness. "You're attentive," Renata said. "That's charming, but I want to be honest with you, because I think you're a smart woman, and I respect that." She tilted her head. Nathaniel Caldwell is a 73-year-old man in early cognitive decline. He gets confused. He forms attachments to caregivers, to service staff. It's very common with the condition. Whatever he may have communicated to you tonight, I want you to understand that it comes from a place of confusion, not reality. His family has a structure in place to protect him, and that structure is working. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Waverly looked at her. He ordered the lamb, Waverly said, broke down the braising method with me, knew what a gastrique was, remembered my name from my name tag without prompting. She kept her voice even. That's not confusion. That's a man who can't hear well and has been placed in situations where that disadvantage is maximized. The smile on Renata's face did not disappear. It simply recalibrated. You've been at this restaurant for a year? 14 months, Renata said. I know your manager. I know Gaspard Vell personally, and I'll tell you something about the restaurant business in this city. It's extraordinarily small. She let that sit for exactly the right number of seconds. I hope you have a lovely rest of your evening. She turned and walked back toward the dining room. Waverly stood in the service corridor for a moment. The threat had been delivered with manicure-perfect precision. She was aware of what it meant for her job, for her father's medication schedule, for the fragile architecture of payments she had been maintaining for 4 years. She was also aware, with perfect clinical clarity, of what the pattern Nathan Caldwell had described actually looked like from the outside. She had written a paper in her second year at Johns Hopkins about the biochemical markers of pharmaceutical-induced cognitive suppression, the kind that produced symptoms resembling early dementia but were fully reversible once the medication was discontinued. The paper had been cited twice in elder care legal cases. She had not thought about it in 2 years. She thought about it now with a precision that surprised her, the way dormant knowledge sometimes surfaces exactly when it is needed. She did not know whether Nathan Caldwell was being medicated without his informed consent. She had no evidence of that. What she had was a pattern and a very quiet, very fierce instinct. She had developed over 4 years of watching her father navigate a medical system that consistently assumed his limitations before he declared them. She went back to the floor and finished her shift. The call came 11 days later. She was at home between shifts when an unknown number appeared on her phone. She answered it. "This is Nathan Caldwell," said the voice on the other end. It was the same measured, dignified voice from the restaurant, and it sounded, she thought, like it had slept better recently. "I'm calling from my original office line. I want you to know I went to the clinic you mentioned. I brought my daughter-in-law's brother, who is an attorney, because I haven't seen my own attorney in 4 months. A pause. You were correct that this was not normal." Waverly sat down on the edge of her bed. Renata Voss had, in fact, informed my attorney of 4 decades that I was transitioning to a family legal team, and he should direct all correspondence to her office. He complied because he had no reason not to. She had a document with my signature on it. I've since determined the signature was on a consent form I signed for what I was told was a dietary supplement program. His voice was careful and exact, the voice of a man reconstructing a sequence of events he was still partly ashamed he had not seen sooner. The clinic has referred my case to the district attorney's office. There is also a question of the physician she introduced me to, and whether my medication this past year has been consistent with my actual diagnosis. Waverly said nothing. She sat with it. "I also want to tell you," Nathan Caldwell said, "that my son didn't know. I want to be clear about that." Edmund had been told, repeatedly, that I had asked to step back from certain decisions. He believed it because he had no reason not to, and because he was busy, and because she was very good at what she did. Another pause. "He's not taking it particularly well." "That's understandable," Waverly said. "I wanted to ask you something." His tone shifted slightly, less the tone of a report, more the tone of a question he had been sitting with. "Why did you do it? You had every reason not to." Waverly was quiet for a moment. She thought about her father, and about the grocery list, and about the way certain silences accumulate into something that begins to look, from the outside, like absence. "My father has Parkinson's," she said. There was a period, early on, when people around him started making decisions for him before he'd asked them to. They thought they were helping. She paused. They were wrong. It cost him a lot. Not money, other things. The kind of things you can't get back. Nathan Caldwell was quiet for a moment. "How is he now?" he asked. "Stable," she said. "We found a program that's working." "Good," he said. And then, "The reason I called, beyond what I've told you, I wanted to let you know that I spoke with Edmund, and we've spoken with Gaspard Vell. I understand you work for a man named Spears who may have made your position at that restaurant untenable following that evening." Waverly said, with precision. He indicated my tenure might be reconsidered. "Yes, well." Nathan Caldwell's voice carried, for the first time, a dry note that sounded like the man he had probably been for most of his life. "I've resolved that. But I also want to tell you that Edmund has been looking for someone, not a legal role, and not a medical role, exactly. He's been building out a compliance and ethics division at Caldwell Group. He has been looking, specifically, for people with scientific training and the kind of judgment that isn't taught in business school." He paused. I told him I'd met someone recently who struck me as exactly that kind of person. I told him she was currently refilling water glasses at Maison Soleil. Waverly looked at the wall across from her bed. She had a photograph of her father, pinned there from his retirement party. Him holding a rolled set of engineering blueprints like a scepter, grinning the grin of a man who still, at that point, remembered everything. "I'd want to hear more about it," she said. "Edmund will call you," Nathan said, "and Ms. Hess. Thank you. Not for my sake particularly, though I do mean that. For the sake of making it slightly harder, going forward, for the room to ignore the people it doesn't think it needs to listen to." Waverly said she would look forward to Edmund's call. She thanked him. She set her phone down on the bed. Outside, the October light had turned that particular shade of amber it reaches in Philadelphia in the late afternoon, the light that makes old stone buildings look like they've been lit from within. She sat in it for a while without doing anything else. She thought about the note, about the moment she had palmed it off the table, and the 2 seconds before that, when she had almost not, about the service corridor and Renata Voss's smile, and the specific vocabulary of threats delivered in a pleasant register, which she had encountered once before from a department head at Johns Hopkins who had told her, with great warmth, that her funding request was not going to move forward this cycle, and that she should consider what she was trying to achieve here very carefully. She had not, in the end, achieved what she had been trying to achieve at Johns Hopkins. She had left, and it had cost her, and she had built something else from the pieces. And the pieces were neither what she had planned nor entirely insufficient. She thought about Nathan Caldwell saying, for the sake of making it slightly harder for the room to ignore the people it doesn't think it needs to listen to. She was 29 years old. She had been a back waiter for 14 months, and before that a doctoral candidate in biochemistry, and before that a sister and a daughter and a person who had learned, out of necessity, to pay very careful attention in rooms that assumed she wasn't. She thought that was probably, in the end, a reasonable set of qualifications. She got up, made coffee, and called her father to ask him how he was doing. He answered on the second ring, his voice clear and slightly amused, the way it got when he had been watching old engineering documentaries, and had thoughts about them. She listened, and she laughed, and outside the amber light shifted to rose, and then to the deep, particular blue that comes over the city just before the streetlights blink on. Some things you carry long enough that you stop thinking of them as weight. They become the architecture of how you move through a room, quietly, carefully, always watching, always facing the person everyone else has already looked away from. And sometimes, in the rooms that believe they are in charge of what gets noticed, that turns out to be the most useful thing you have.